Hi, everyone, and welcome to American Voices. I'm Paola Ramos, in for Alicia Menendez. We start tonight with breaking news. The United States formally going there, accusing Russia of committing crimes against humanity in Ukraine. The bombshell was dropped today by Vice President Kamala Harris during her address at the Munich Security Conference. Harris, a short time ago, saying that justice must be served.
The United States has formally determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity. And I say to all those who have perpetrated these crimes and to their superiors who are complicit in these crimes, you will be held to account.
Now, all of this ahead of President Biden's trip to Poland on Monday to mark 1 year since President Putin began his assault on Ukraine, which has become the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II, and there's no end in sight. It was nearly 1 year ago that Russia used Belarus territory to send troops into Ukraine. Remember those images, right? And just yesterday, Putin hosted the president of Belarus for talks on expanding military and economic cooperation between the two nations. Meanwhile, back in Munich, Ukrainian President Zelensky thanked Western allies for their support in a virtual address, stressing that more military aid is needed and fast.
I wanted to hear from the world, Ukraine, we will be with you. Unfortunately, I heard it only after Russian missiles struck our land. That is why we need to hurry up. We need the speed of our agreements, speed of our delivery to strengthen our speed of decisions to limit Russian potential. There is no alternative to speed, because it is the speed that the life depends on.
Now, that urgency comes as new polling shows that American support for Ukraine aid has actually decreased. 48% say they support the U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine, but that's actually down from 60% last May. Now, I'd like to bring in California Congressman and senior member of the Armed Forces Committee, John Garamendi. He recently traveled to Poland and Romania to receive updates on the war. Sir, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Good to be with you.
So, Congressman, we have the vice president with these really strong words, essentially formally accusing Russia of committing crimes against humanity in Ukraine. First of all, I want to talk about your reaction to this, and how do you think this actually holds Putin accountable?
It's a very, very important step forward. This is the formal process. We've known for really the outset of this invasion by Russia that they were committing crimes against humanity. The case had to be built, and that's what's happened over the last year, piece by piece, investigation, death and murder. All of those are now accounted for, and the formal declaration is made. That will hold Putin, his heads of his military, as well as individual soldiers, accountable. And at some point, it's quite possible that Putin will be hauled off to The Hague for the World Court there and be held to account, just as happened in the Balkans with the Kosovo wars 20 years ago. It's a very important step.
So, these are still words. This is still a narrative. Yeah. But on the ground, Russia has still been able to continue this war despite the aid that Ukraine is getting. You were just on the ground. You've been there. You've been seeing things.
Right.
What can you tell us about the way that resources are actually getting through Ukraine and where it's most needed?
Well, the United States has delivered into Europe nearly 18, almost $19 billion of military equipment. The Javelin missiles, all of that, the armaments, as well as the artillery and the munitions that go with it. We wanted to make sure that it was going forward. There's some pushback among some of the extreme MAGA Republicans in Congress saying that we ought to stop because this stuff is being diverted. So Mike Rogers, the chairman of the committee, I and 5 others went to see what was going on, both in Greece and Romania, where some 20% of the material flows, and then again in Poland, where 80%. And we looked at the paperwork. We traced the paperwork all the way through. And we know now that the military equipment is getting to the front line. When we were there, there was about 100 yards of munitions laying on it had just been taken off an airplane, and it was immediately put onto various mechanisms to get it into Ukraine. And it left as we were standing there.
Congressman, there's some of your own colleagues that are saying that perhaps more is needed. Now, some are even saying, bipartisan folks are saying that perhaps it's necessary to send fighter jets. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, we ought to round up all of the Russian fighter jets, some of which are still in the Eastern European former Warsaw countries. Those jets are very satisfactory for what Ukraine needs, and the Ukraine already has all of the maintenance programs, the skilled technicians, as well as the skilled pilots. That would be the first step. The American F-16s are a very sophisticated fighter jet, and very difficult maintenance programs are necessary. And beyond that, those jets are not going to be particularly useful in the front line on the eastern part of Ukraine. Russia has an S-400 air defense system, which is an extraordinary system and very, very deadly with a very long range. They can cover nearly the entire eastern part of Ukraine from Russia. And so those jets flying at that front line are going to be seriously endangered. There are other equipment that should serve well. With regard to the missiles that Russia is sending into Ukraine, creating extraordinary damage, there are European countries, specifically NATO countries, that are willing to send their air defense systems. Again, they are Soviet air defense systems, but very good, into Ukraine. They want to be sure that they're going to be backfilled, and this is one of the issues that we took up on our trip, how to backfill, how to make sure that these countries are not left defenseless as they send their current missile defense systems to Ukraine.
As you know, Congressman, President Biden is headed to Poland next week. What do you think his message needs to be? What would you recommend?
It ought to be exactly what he said at the State of the Union. It ought to be what he said this last week, and that is, we are all in. We are not going to abandon Ukraine. We're going to provide them with everything they need that they can use at that particular time. And we're going to continue doing it. Yes, it is expensive, but I want the American public to realize what happens if we do not. Before this fight started, NATO and Biden attempted to negotiate with Putin. Putin refused to negotiate and put forward a demand that essentially was that the NATO countries in the Eastern Front, that's Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and the Baltic countries, all had to leave NATO, and Russia would be reestablishing the Warsaw Pact, which is the old Soviet Union pact, basically dominating Eastern Europe. Now, that's bad enough. But if we were to do that, what is the message to China? If we abandon Ukraine, what is the message to Taiwan? The message to China is, do anything you want, China, because the United States is not a steadfast ally and will crumble and go home. The answer is no, we're not going to crumble. We're not going to go. We're going to be determined to see this through to success, so that both Russia and China know that they're not going to mess with the United States, they're not going to mess with NATO and our allies in the Western Pacific.
Sir, I want to switch topics for a second, only because you find yourself in a pretty unique position, probably a position that you never would have ever imagined. You're a member of one of the most polarizing House subcommittees, the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. Well, that's the name. But here's the thing, as you know, there's a Washington Post ABC News poll that finds that a majority of Americans don't think it's legitimate. In fact, I think it's 56%. You can see that down there. 56% say that the committee is just an attempt to score political points. So first of all, since you're there, you're in that room, you've been part of those hearings, what's going on there? How do you navigate, this room that is full of conspiracy theories And
well, that's exactly
you actually
right.
have a stake in how to navigate the conversations that are taking place there?
Stacey Puskett, the delegate from the Virgin Islands, is an extraordinary woman. She's our leader, a skilled lawyer, and a very forceful, powerful individual. She's made it very clear. Our task is the truth squad. We're going to simply display the truth. And we did that with the very first hearing. The extreme MAGA Republicans came forward with their witnesses who had no facts whatsoever. They made some wild allegations. Mostly they were mad at not being successful themselves or people not listening to them. They're not listening because they don't have facts. Anyway, we're the truth squad, and we will provide the truth. We will push back strongly. We will show the facts, and we will carry on. At the end, as this process proceeds towards an end, this Mr. Jordan and his extreme MAGA Republicans are going to find themselves in a very difficult position. They don't have the facts. They are simply engaging in various wild conspiracy theories, none of which are true, and they're wasting an enormous amount of time. What cannot happen is for Jordan to be able to use his committee as a weapon to harm the legitimate policies of the current administration. There are plenty of things to investigate, but the weaponization of the federal government is not one of them. And this committee cannot become a weapon in Mr. Jordan's hands, and we will not let it happen.
So what is the actual strategy, right, for Democrats like yourself on this committee? I know that the strategy is to speak truth, but practically,
well, here's the strategy. Here's the strategy. Try to get Mr. Jordan to work with us, at least to tell us what the next hearing's about and who the witnesses are. Allow us to bring our own witnesses. This is normal procedure in Congress. But Jordan gives us maybe 12 hours notice, but we'll try to work with him, try to get the information, and then we will seek out the truth. And we will present that truth in a forceful, straightforward, honest way. And Mr. Jordan can find his conspiracy theories debunked. Will he stop? Well, at some point, I believe the media is going to say this is a complete waste of time, and there are legitimate things that we need to investigate. Certainly, we need to investigate the ongoing issues of how foreign countries, China, Russia, others, are engaging in our election programs. We need to investigate how the conspiracy theories and those who use those theories are harming the electoral process by driving out of the voluntary offices those people that have worked so hard on the elections over the years. So there are things that we should be investigating. We should be investigating the IRS and why the IRS is targeting African Americans more than any other group, and also why the IRS didn't follow the law and investigate Trump's taxes.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for being on the ground and for being our eyes on the ground. I really appreciate you tonight.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Of course, and joining me from Munich, actually, is NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thank you so much. I know it's late over there.
So it's good to talk to you, Paula. What a night. This has been an extraordinary day and evening, as you've been reporting. I've been listening to your conversation with the congressman.
Well,
Paula?
So tell us about that, Andrea. I mean, I know you just had your second exclusive with the vice president. Obviously, her remarks, her words, very strong condemnation on Russia. What has been the reaction on the ground?
Well, people are reacting very well, very positively from the U.S. delegation, of course, and allies, the Germans, the French, the others here. This was a very strong speech, and she laid out the concerns about China on Ukraine. Specifically, she raised the issue for the first time that the U.S. is concerned that China is getting closer and closer to Russia, and in her speech to this world gathering, with, of course, the Chinese in the audience, said that China is also considering sending weapons to Russia for Ukraine. That would be crossing a line. That would be the first time that has happened in this war. It's something the U.S. has been monitoring very closely, as you can imagine, through diplomatic circles and other means that they have to monitor these things. She raised that, so I went over to see her. She had an exclusive chat with me after the speech, immediately after the speech, over in her offices across the street here. And she again raised the issue. We talked about, of course, the crimes against humanity, the war crimes that she laid out in very passionate detail here, the atrocities, Mariupol, Bucha, the maternity ward in Mariupol, the theater that, of course, was bombed. The maternity ward bombed, the woman who died on her stretcher. We all saw it. The whole world saw all of that, Paula, and said that Russia has to be held accountable, including their superiors. I asked her if that meant Vladimir Putin, everybody from the frontline soldiers up to Vladimir Putin, and she said everyone involved, everyone who we can prove is complicit. We were also told by the Deputy Attorney General here, Lisa Monaco, today, that the FBI has been assembling evidence, as well as the Attorney General was in Ukraine last summer teaching the Ukrainians how to salvage, how to save, preserve evidence, how to research the war crimes, all of that taking place. And we also, of course, talked today about the China balloon, and that was the subject now of a late-night meeting here, the first face-to-face meeting between Secretary Blinken and his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. Wang Yi had earlier here at the conference given a very aggressive speech to the conference, denying that the balloon was a spy balloon, saying it was a civilian airship, and saying that the United States was getting hysterical in its reaction. It was a very aggressive speech. He also spoke about the Ukraine war. So Blinken raised both of those subjects, I should say, with young Wang Yi in about an hour's meeting. This was an attempt to warn the Chinese against supplying weapons, lethal aid to Russia, how serious a step that would be, and laying this out in very direct and forceful, direct and clear terms, we should say, according to U.S. officials and according to the Secretary himself, as he then told Chuck Todd in a taping tonight for Meet the Press. So you're going to see the Secretary's full remarks on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd tomorrow, and then he will be heading on to Turkey and Greece, as a matter of fact, for the rest of his European trip.
Yep, we'll be watching that tomorrow with Chuck Todd. Andrea Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Coming up, ratings versus the truth, what we've learned about Fox News and its coverage of the 2020 election. A new court filing is revealing the decision the network chose. And we'll talk to a state senator from Kentucky about her fight against a Republican effort that allows teachers to deny a student's gender identity. And later, a professor from Michigan State University on how the campus moves forward less than a week after 3 people were killed by a gunman. But first, let's talk to Richard Louie with a look at the other big stories that we're watching this hour on MSNBC. Richard?
Paula, very good evening to you. Former President Jimmy Carter receiving hospice care today. His foundation announcing that after a series of short hospital stays, he decided to spend his remaining time at home with his family rather than receiving additional medical intervention. Carter turning 98 in October.
So it's been a really bad week for the big lie. The lawsuit has indicated Fox News knew that former President Trump's claim of a stolen election were false. A court filing from Dominion Voting Systems shows Fox News anchors repeated the fraud narrative to boost ratings. So they chose ratings over truth. Per the filing, Chairman Rupert Murdoch called the election conspiracies, quote, really crazy stuff behind closed doors. As for holding the big lie accountable, an excerpt from the Fulton County, Georgia Special Grand Jury report confirms once again that there was no widespread fraud in the 2020 presidential election. The panel also recommended perjury charges for at least one witness who is not named. Joining me now is MSNBC political contributor Greg Bluestein. He's a political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and, of course, the author of Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. We also have Jill Wine-Banks. She's a former Watergate prosecutor who co-hosts the #Sisters-in-Law podcast. She's also an MSNBC contributor. And also with us, Angela Caruson, president of Media Matters. Thank you all so much for being with me. Angela, I have to start with you. And I first want to play some of the election coverage from Fox News. Let's take a look.
If you're a Trump voter and you suspect that this election was stolen, was rigged, you're onto something. The 2020 presidential election was not fair. No honest person would claim that it was fair.
The Dominion software, I know that there were voting irregularities. Tell me about that.
That's to put it mildly.
The company is called Dominion Voting. Dominion came under heavy fire after allegations that their machines caused thousands of votes in one Michigan county to be switched from Donald Trump to Joe Biden.
Okay, Angela, I know you've been tracking this for a really long time. So did anything surprise you? I mean, is there anything that you read that actually surprised you about what's really going on behind the scenes?
No, I mean, the thing that, I mean, obviously I have to say that to a degree because I'm so steeped in it. I think the one thing that was a big takeaway was the scale. This was industrial scale. And I think the clearest example of that was where Rupert Murdoch instructs Fox News' CEO to sort of shift gears a little bit because of this Dominion coverage he found it not super helpful politically, and to really focus more on winning the Senate race in Georgia, or to try to do their very best to help out in Georgia. And there was a casualness to it, right? Mm-hmm. And that to me was the big takeaway. It didn't seem out of the ordinary at all to be getting the kind of partisan instructions. And so that was one thing. The other thing that I thought was a little surprising, I mean, I am stunned by the hypocrisy. I would say, in some of those segments, if you're going to call Sidney Powell a lunatic, which Hannity did, and then host her at the same day that you're attacking her behind the scenes for pushing these ideas, even that was to me was a little bit stunning.
And then I think, Greg, what's really clear is this sense of panic, this idea that they were panicking over the potential loss of viewers to places like Newsmax or OAN. And what does that tell you about the current evolution of the Republican Party?
What really struck me was they weren't just panicking about loss of viewers. They were panicking over the network's correct call that Arizona had gone to the Democrats, to President Joe Biden, and the behind-the-scenes texts and emails and correspondence about that accurate call really stunned me, because it just reminded us of how much they were pandering to a certain viewer. And look, the Republican Party, we've also seen Georgia Republicans and Republicans across the nation, getting on Fox News and repeating some of these lies as their top priorities.
And Jill, I mean, Dominion is suing Fox for nearly $2 billion. I mean, that's a lot of money. Which side has a stronger argument? I suspect I know what you're going to say, but I'm thinking about Fox News's, attempt to claim the First Amendment, no?
That will fail. And let me just say that when this was first announced as a lawsuit, I said this could be the end of Fox News. 1.6 is really about what they make every year, but it would be a significant dent. And the only thing that surprises me about what we're now seeing in these text messages and emails is that they had them in writing, that they kept them. This is incredible. It's not a surprise that they knew they were lying and that they were promoting these lies and that they were putting on people they were making fun of because it was so incredible. But it is a surprise that they were careless enough to create an evidentiary chain that proves one of the hardest parts of a defamation case to prove, which is that you knowingly lie. And this shows a malicious knowing intent. And I would say this is a case that they might as well settle, because they're going to pay a lot in legal fees and they're going to lose, and they'll have to compensate not only for the damages, but for legal fees on the other side as well as their own.
Jill, you say that they should settle. I suspect that they won't. I mean, what is the strategy there? Why wouldn't they?
Well, they're not going to settle because they have to keep this pretense up, because they did lose some viewers. And as you said in your introduction, this was a case where they chose viewers and ratings over the truth, which is, of course, the exact opposite you would want on any news or anything that says it's a news channel, even though they'll now claim, well, we're just entertainment and opinion, we're not news. There is no real strategy other than delay and hoping that because they have more money, I am sure, than Dominion. Remember, there's another suit by Smartmatic, a similar company that they accused also of flipping votes, and that even combined, those companies do not have the economic resources that are available to Fox. So maybe they're just hoping that they can force a lower settlement cost because of the expense of pursuing the case. I hope not, and I suspect that there would be a lot of lawyers who will volunteer to provide free legal services. Mm-hmm. And there is, you had asked about the First Amendment. You don't have a First Amendment right to defame someone, and that's what this is.
Right, and we know, Angela, Fox News isn't the only entity that is putting profits and ratings over truth. We know that there are more media outlets out there, but how do you think this sets the stage, in terms of holding other media outlets accountable in the future?
I think it does. I mean, I think what it does demonstrate is that there's a line, and we've sort of seen this model beginning to unravel a little bit with the Alex Jones, for example, and the litigation by the Sandy Hook families. There's some accountability there. This idea that we have to draw a line in the first place, and the Fox, I think, will be the next up, and it won't just be them losing the case that'll be a dent. It'll be the lawsuits that they'll then get from shareholders for the misrepresentations, for the breach of fiduciary duties that'll follow. And then the third part of this is that ultimately this is a commercial entity. It's not, we talk about Fox like it's a political entity, because it is, but it also at its core is a business, which means it has business partners, it has advertisers, it has cable carriers. These are business relationships. And one of the things we saw with One American News is that business relationships were reconsidered once the spotlight was shown on just how risky, volatile, and destructive the model really was. And what we're seeing right now is not just, critiques, not just the edges, the penumbra of Fox's deception, deceit, and damage, but we're actually seeing a laser focus right on what Fox News at its core, which is a destructive political operation. And I do think in the short term, you're going to see additional entities reconsider their business relationships. And that $1.6 billion, that revenue that was referenced earlier, that's going to start to decline independent of whether or not they win this litigation because of the commercial pressures that'll be on them.
Yeah, let's hope this makes a change. Greg, before we go, I do want to go to Fulton County. And we know that District Attorney Fannie Willis has said she's considering racketeering charges. What does your reporting indicate about potential indictments?
Well, look, we know for sure that the grand jury is recommending perjury charges. Now, she could pursue that sort of single, more narrow focus, or we also know she's been exploring anti-racketeering charges. Should be a lot more complicated, but also feasible. She's done it before. She's used anti-racketeering charges in Georgia to pursue teachers in a cheating scandal in Atlanta public schools. And so that's one avenue. There's a lot we don't know, though. We don't know still whether or not she'll actually bring any charges. We don't know who she'll target. We don't know when they'll come. But what we do know is when Donald Trump says that he's been exonerated, that is a flat out lie, because the report has still not said whether or not the charges have been recommended against him.
That's right. All eyes on her. Greg, Jill, and Angela, thank you all so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. Next, the rights of transgender people. The state Senate passed a bill this week allowing teachers to refuse to refer to trans students by their preferred pronouns. The legislation now moves to the Republican-controlled House, where it's, of course, likely to pass. The bill also allows parents to interfere with lessons plans on sexuality. Teachers will have to notify parents 2 weeks prior to any such lessons and allow parents to opt out for their children. And let's be clear, what's happening in Kentucky is not an isolated incident. LGBTQ rights are under attack across the nation. Florida, as you know, was one of the very first states to ban teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation in schools last year. And since then, at least a dozen other states have introduced similar legislation. Kentucky State Senator Karen Berg has been a strong advocate against her state's new anti-LGBTQ bill. She's also been an incredible ally. Her son, Henry Berg, was transgender. He died by suicide last year. She joins me now. Thank you so much, Representative. I really appreciate you coming on.
And thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Of course, and I wish it would be under better circumstances, but let's start with the bill that's in front of you right now. Tell me a little bit more about the bill. Now, why do you think this is happening now, and what is at the core of the movement there?
Well, that's two different questions. One is tell me about the bill, and then the second question is why do you think this is happening? So let me begin by just telling you about the bill. SB 150, when it was originally presented on the floor with a fiery speech about how we were going to stop wokeness in our schools, was actually an extremely broad bill that would allow any parent for any reason to opt out of any mental health care services offered at school for any reason. And I mean, that clearly on its face is dangerous. You know, we saw with Ethan Crumbly's parents that they were called into school. They were asked to take their child home. They refused to do it. I mean, we just can't have parents in the Commonwealth just refusing to acknowledge that their child may have a mental health care issue. So they came back and they changed that part of the bill, basically took it out. The second part of the bill was supposed to be this enumeration of what could and couldn't be taught in health, like sex education. Mm-hmm. It took that out and basically just said that parents have the right to give permission or not for their children to sit in sex ed classes, which is a right that already exists. And they also said that the parents have a right to their child's medical records, which is a right that already exists. Remember, this is a parents' rights bill. So you can understand, they're enumerating parents' rights. And then in the middle of this parent right bill, they put two paragraphs that says that the Kentucky Department of Education and the Kentucky Board of Education, both of whom had issued guidelines for how trans students are supposed to be treated and respected at school, they basically said that the Kentucky Board of Education and the Kentucky Department of Education is not allowed to request or require anybody to gender affirm an openly trans or known to be trans child in school. My amendment, which they refused to hear, would have said, okay, as the parent of a trans child, knowing the data, and they had the data in their hands. I mean, the articles were either discussed with me personally or given to them. But we have good data that's published from this country that shows that the increase of gender affirming pronouns in a single context, like at home, at school, at work, decreases suicidal ideation by 29% and actual suicidal action by 56%. So as the parent of a trans child, I should have the right, if they need a note from a healthcare provider, I can get it, to say at school, my child needs to be appropriately affirmed. No, this bill in a parent's rights bill denies me as a parent the ability to do that. They took that entirely away. Now, why did they do that? Well, I can tell you why they did that. Unfortunately, and I suspect you know this, there's a political culture war, and certain politicians have decided that children are 100% fair game. So in this state, we currently have a Democratic governor, very popular Democratic governor, who is running for re-election. But we have a supermajority Republican House and Senate. And honestly, one of my colleagues from the Senate is running as lieutenant governor in a crowded Republican field. So what they're trying to do is distinguish themselves each further to the right from each other in a hope to win the Republican nomination in this state. And who they put in the middle and who they hurt in the course of all this does not matter to them. And it is not that they have not been given the data that this hurts children, not that they don't acknowledge that mental health is as important as physical health, particularly for our younger, vulnerable children. It is that they don't care. They see this as a possible political win.
I think you said it there, Senator. They don't care. And you just broke down exactly what that means. And at times that means it's a deadly cost. So thank you so much, State Senator. I wish we could continue talking, but I want to thank you for your bravery, for your voice, and for continuing to keep Henry's legacy alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Of course. Now to another fight. Before that, though, I do need to say something. If you or anyone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, you can call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. I should have mentioned before, it's always important to talk about that. Now, yes, let's go to another fight for the transgender community. Fair representation in the media. Over 1,000 New York Times contributors are asking the paper to improve its coverage of trans people, writing, quote, "We are disappointed to see the New York Times follow the lead of far-right hate groups in presenting gender diversity. More than 100 advocacy groups are also urging the Times to change its approach to trans stories. For example, GLAAD. They sent a letter signed by dozens of nonprofits and also held a protest outside of the Times offices. And yet, the New York Times has defended its reporting. And just a day after journalists and activists submitted their demands, the Times published a defense of J.K. Rowling, who has made transphobic remarks. You probably read them. And joining me here on set in New York City is Chase Strango, Deputy Director for Trans Justice for the ACLU. Thank you so much, Chase, for being here again. I wish it was under different circumstances, but here we go. No, here we are one more time. To put it completely simply for our audience, how is the New York Times reinforcing this anti-trans narrative? What are they doing wrong?
Yeah, I first want to say that this isn't new. And I think that's one of the important things that the contributor letter pointed out, is that you can go back in history and see this over and over again. And particularly if you go back and look at early coverage of gay people, coverage of the AIDS epidemic, this is something that the Times has done by failing to have a self-reflective analysis of the biases they bring to the coverage of certain communities, and especially the trans community. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the context of the trans community, I've been pointing out since 2016 that this has been an ongoing problem in which we see coverage of trans people done in a way that looks like a press release from a far-right organization. Not unlike how we see press releases from police departments coming in and becoming news stories that look like press releases. And this is incredibly insidious in this moment because we're seeing an escalating set of attacks on the trans community with over 300 pieces of legislation introduced just this year. It is February. And not only have there been 300 pieces of legislation introduced, they are the #1 priority in states. In the midst of, the continued post-pandemic realities, current pandemic realities, so many things that people are grappling with, and yet we are seeing these bills push through in states across the country. And this is how the Times covers our lives, as if there's some sort of vast conspiracy in which there's too many of us.
I think typically people disconnect what's going on in state legislatures, what's going on with these anti-trans bills, and the way that media is misrepresenting this. Draw the line for us directly.
Yeah, I think the reality is that it's two parts of the same set of normative problems, which is that people have a reflexive discomfort and misunderstanding about trans people. That allows them to dehumanize us. That happens in the Capitol buildings, and that happens on the pages of the New York Times. Our bodies are talked about in sensational ways. Our healthcare is made to seem like it is part of some conspiracy in which children are being harmed. And the rhetoric of harmed children, the rhetoric of confusion about trans lives, then propagates these narratives that are lifted up in state houses and then also continue to be reinforced in the pages of publications that people get their information from. And so we create a culture in which people don't understand what it means to be trans. And this isn't just about healthcare. I think Jonathan Chait had this piece that was like, oh, well, this is about real harms, not like the bathroom context, which that's just wrong. States are passing bathroom bills now. States are criminalizing trans adults going to the bathroom. None of those things have stopped. And all of them have been fueled by the way in which misinformation about trans people has been held up in a lot of publications that we would consider to be center-left publications.
You made it all the way to 30 Rock on a Saturday night. I'm sorry, but you have a room full of producers here, folks in the control room, thousands of people hopefully that are watching. What is your advice to journalists? How do we get this right?
I mean, I think first and foremost, we need to listen to trans people. And then as non-trans people, as institutions, we have to reflect on the ways in which we've all internalized anti-trans bias. I think the most remarkable thing about the statement from the Times is that they just sort of dismissed everything out of hand and said, listen, our coverage is fair and sensitive. Nobody's coverage is fair and sensitive. Nobody is talking about communities that they're not a part of in a way that is deeply empathetic and sensitive to the realities of what it means to live in the world as a person who is trans right now. So we have to understand that there is a large context here. And I think for people listening, that it is very systematically designed to be about quote unquote harming children. Mm-hmm. But what we're seeing in state legislatures goes far beyond children. We have bans on care for adults. We have criminal laws that would make it a crime for a trans adult to go into a restroom where there may be a minor present. I'm a trans adult. I have a minor child. Think about what that means, and think about the history of situating people as threats to minors for just existing. And know that that is how we led to the types of dehumanization that we are still recovering from in this country and around the world.
Jace, thank you. And as you said, we all play a role in dehumanizing trans lives. So thank you for talking to us tonight. Really appreciate it. We'll be right back.